Hello and welcome. This will be a short video about a music generation system from the 1980s. My name is Nikita Vraginsky, and this presentation will be jointly hosted by me and Eamon Bell, whom I'd like to ask to present himself.
Hi, my name is Eamon Bell, and I am a postdoctoral research fellow at the Department of Music in Trinity College Dublin, where I work currently on the CD, but more generally, I'm interested in the history of digital technology and music and sound recording equipment.
Thank you. Maybe I should also say a couple of words about what I do at the moment. I'm a researcher at the music department at Humboldt University of Berlin, working on music technology and mathematics, how they have come together to form what we now have as musical artificial intelligence. So this program from the 1980s that we'll be discussing today is called IMG1, Incidental Music Generator 1. It was created by the programmer and musician Peter Langston in the 1980s while he was working at the research organization called Bellcore in the United States. So me and Eamon both experimented with the program and tried to look under the hood what goes on there, how the program makes the music. And now we'd like to share our experience with you in this video. Maybe it's a good idea to give a brief visual impression of what the program looked like. I'll start sharing my screen. I have a small presentation there. Can you see the presentation? So this is a screenshot from the program from the time when the program was still whole, when it had not only its mathematical logics, but also the graphical user interface, which we no longer have. Because the program has been saved for posterity without the graphical user interface as a program that can be only used via text input. Now this is what the program looked like to us when we started to experiment with it. Even maybe you would like to tell about your experience of making this program run now in 2021.
Sure, yeah, thanks, Nikita. In some ways, this video is a reflection on precisely that, what steps that the researcher has to do to try and reconstruct the computing environment from that time period. And there are lots of differences between the computing environments that we have available to us now and that Peter Langston had available to him at Bellcore. And because I suppose both of us share this idea that it's all very well and good to like analyze the source code kind of abstractly for this piece of software, it's even better or desirable to try and get it to run and see what it looks like as a user. Notwithstanding what Nikita just said about the fact that we don't have the graphical user interface, right? Like we can't reconstruct it entirely because this, at the end of the day, was commercial software, but we have to deal with what we've got in terms of the historical record. And so Nikita had successfully run it at some point in the recent past, and then invited me to try it out myself and kind of report back and share notes about some of the struggles that it turns out we both had some very similar struggles in getting it to run. And I suppose the most difficult problem problem to overcome is the fact that this software is written for a kind of a computing platform that is obsolete or is not very widely used now, called Sun OS, which then became the Solaris operating system, which is still in use. That operating system, the version of the operating system this runs on is from the 1990s. Not only that, not only does the operating system, so like, you know, when I say operating system, I mean like Macintosh, Windows, whatever, the contemporary operating systems of today. And not only is the operating system different, but the computer architecture on which it runs is different as well. And that's a kind of technical point, but it's important because it means that neither Nikita or I can simply kind of try and compile, which is to say kind of create a new program out of the source materials for our own computers. In fact, we have to kind of simulate the structure of an entirely different computer within our own computers. So that's kind of the first step that we both encountered, was identifying a suitable so-called emulator to simulate or emulate this older computing architecture within our contemporary computers. And then very, very quickly, we run into the second difficulty of how to get not only Langston software into that simulated version, simulated computer, but also to get the generated files out. And we can talk about that, but I suppose one final thing, maybe Nikita, you can talk about what we were just looking at on the screen. We both got to this point after a lot of back and forth, to a point where we could actually run the program using the text mode interface that we see here. So like the top line, every time we see the hash sign and the words the letters BSSA, that's a different run of the kind of main program within this system. So maybe Nikita, you can talk about what we're looking at here when we see the different things after what BSSA means and the sort of the settings and the options.
So in this screenshot from the emulator, we see 4 times the prompt Sun 3 TME and the number sign, which is the prompt to input the command, and then 3 times different different commands to generate music with the help of the core of the ING. So as we have said, we don't have the graphical user interface anymore, but we still have the musical generating logic. And this is done by this main program called BSSA, followed by a couple of settings. The first setting, -L, which stands for length, 25 generates 25 seconds of MIDI music, or music in the MIDI format, which is a format which does not contain recorded audio, but just information about which note to play when and so on. And then there are various other settings, the most important of which is the last one, which sets the style of the piece to be generated. We have grass, which is explained in the program output as bluegrass banjo music, and we have bebop, which is explained as bebop jazz. And the program is clever enough to create a sensible musical structure for these very short 25 seconds, with a beginning and an end and a couple of repeating parts in the middle, which all have the normal length of like 4 or 8 or 16 measures. So this program adheres to musical tradition while generating the pieces. So to fit our setting of bebop jazz, for example, and the length of 25 seconds, the program calculated that the tempo should be 183 beats per minute, so that this whole structure with the beginning and the end and all else that I've mentioned will fit into the time frame of 25 seconds. That we can experiment with it at all is a historical coincidence, because the program was never really published. It was developed at Belcore research company or organization, but then it kind of disappeared. But its author, Peter Langston, published an article in which the program was explained, and from this article is actually the only source for the screenshot that we've been showing. But then the program disappeared, and it was only because another person who worked on it published the code online, that we both, Eamon and me, were able to download it and to put it into the emulator and to experiment with it.
Yeah, that's typical, right? I mean, we know about a lot of music composition and just music technology tools from these journal articles from places like Computer Music Journal and so on. And sometimes we don't have even a recording of how those systems sounded. Occasionally those journals came with CDs that had recordings of the systems so that we have a sense of how they sounded. But in many, many cases, a lot of the software that the original, let's say, source code, or even just the original executable files for a lot of systems that have been described in the literature have either kind of been lost or kind of languish on the hard drives of a lot of the people who created them. So yeah, I think it's important to underscore what Nikita just said. It is kind of historical accident that we are able to experiment with this at all. And there are reasons why people don't want to share their code. There are reasons why we don't have the full code right now with the graphical interface, to do with presumably intellectual property situation. So on the one hand, we work with what we've got, but on the other hand, I think it's interesting to reflect on archiving and preservation practices now for musicians, because in 10 or 15 years, we might like to study these systems in similar ways. And another comment, speaking back just to the technical challenges, Nikita mentioned that these source code files were stored on the internet by a colleague of Peter Langston. And I made quite a big deal saying it was quite difficult to get the files in and out of this simulated or emulated computer. You might think, well, why don't I just take the emulated computer and point it at the internet, the same website that we downloaded the source code in the first place? But the computing environment that we're simulating predates the World Wide Web. And so even if there was a concept of internet connected computers, very many of the software tools for actually accessing the internet don't exist. This whole model of flow of source code from back and forth was quite different. It was shared through non-World Wide Web internet technologies, even through email, sometimes through Usenet posts, through many other different ways. And so sometimes when you're working with these recreated or simulated environments, the most intuitive solution is not always going to work because of the historical contingencies that this emulated software is a snapshot of the particular computer infrastructure that was available at that time. And that includes not being able to take advantage of contemporary networking technologies. It's another point just to connect with how we actually got this material in the first place. The internet is great for lots of things, but if we try and connect it up to older boxes or older systems, it's not always going to work.
Right. That's a reminder for us that the systems that we have will not last forever like this. Today, it's the most normal thing in the world to do this and that, to use Twitter or whatever. But then imagine a situation a couple of decades in the future where all of this is so old, it no longer works, nobody knows how to use it, there is no good documentation, nobody understands which button to press, and the bugs that people worked around in 2021 without spending a thought on them will be a huge obstruction for the researcher of 2061, 41. Maybe I should stop screen sharing. We've looked at this picture for quite a long time. This music can be, or similar music can be listened to by everyone on the internet still, because the author of the program, Peter Langston, has his website where he has put up a version of this, where you can go to his website at langston.com and press a button to generate a boogie woogie, which is very similar to the MIDIs that we both have been generating with the system via this very difficult procedure. But everyone can do that on the internet. Maybe it's worth noting that at the time, in the 1980s, it was really expensive to generate music of acceptable quality. It is mentioned in the articles and in an interview I did with one of the people who collaborated on the program, on this project. I have been told that a lot of music hardware from the 1980s, the synthesizers, had to be bought and to be available at Belcore to generate what we now take for granted. A freeware program now sits inside our computer, doesn't take up space in the laboratory or on the table, and generating better versions of those MIDIs. But at that time, it was very expensive.
Right, and often sat outside of the computer itself. So like the software that we have, a good amount of the code that's in that bundle of source code is to do with kind of bridging, sending messages to and from synthesizers from the computer that's generating the sounds. So now we don't really think of the sound producing parts of our computer as being anything other than something that we get for free with every single piece of hardware, or something that's simply emulated or recreated in software. That poses interesting challenges for reconstructing how these things sounded as well, right? Because neither you nor I have these old Yamaha synthesizers. So if we were to try and make this very, attempt at an acoustically pure or quote unquote authentic recreation of the sounds, we would struggle because we don't have access maybe to the sound generating hardware. And instead we use, like you said, freeware software that kind of simulates those sounds, but doesn't necessarily, there's no guarantee that it would sound identical to, because the organ sound might be slightly different on one synthesizer versus another, or the banjo sound, to think of the bluegrass example.
Right. Do you want to play the example that you have generated? Do you think it's a good moment?
I do, yeah. I wonder if it will work, to be quite honest. Let me see if I can do this. If not, we'll just move quickly on. So can you see my screen right now?
Yes.
Okay. So in this directory, I have a bunch of ones that I generated earlier on. I kind of like the bluegrass one. This one, number 3. Just let me know if it's working with a head nod, and if it's not, we'll move on. Great. What did you think of that?
I like it. I like it. I like it. I think you can hear in this example first the structure of the piece. It has a beginning, it has an end. When you generated it, you gave it a time setting.
Yeah, I think 30 seconds for my case, so a little bit longer.
The patterns played sound very human, right? And you looked at the code which generates them, I think.
Yeah, while we're here, we might as well just look at it, actually. So yeah, as you said, it sounds human in the sense, in a kind of particular sense, which is that it doesn't, we don't hear any notes that are like really too high or too low for the banjo. They kind of exist within. That's one test. There are many other tests, but one test is that it doesn't jump around in pitch. So we hear things that are quite constrained. And in fact, the constraints in this software dictate precisely what notes we hear, and the way it's implemented in this, I'll talk a little bit more generally, or we can speak a bit more generally about how the system works, but on the level of like how the computer decides what notes to play and when, let's have a look inside the banjo source code. So I wasn't super planning on this, but I guess I want to call your attention to some of these things in the very, very beginning of the code, especially the thing kind of starting here, which is like right-hand plucking patterns. And so this is like thumb, index, middle, thumb, index, middle, thumb, middle, which is, I'm not super familiar with bluegrass banjo 5-string style, but it's a conventional plucking pattern, right? And this data structure contains different ones, like the double thumb, Foggy Mountain, references to particular musicians, and so on. And then the rest of the code, sort of rather complicatedly, with a lot of baked in data or whatever, will actually, like this function banjo play, is going to take a description of the chords that are going to be desired, which comes from another piece of software, and kind of realizes them in kind of relation to the those structures that we looked at the start. So we're rejoining you after the inevitable technical glitch. I was just showing you some code from the IMG software, and it reminded us that even though I had focused in on, in that moment, how the software was making musical sequences seem more plausible as they were being realized by a banjo or a particular computational model of a banjo, we were both reminded that underneath all of this, at the very kind of root or at the very basis of this piece of software, is a random number generator, essentially, which is, or a pseudo random number generator, that is generating unpredictable sequences of data, which then get very rapidly converted into musical signs, whether they be chords or individual notes or progressions of, you know, larger musical sections. The order and the particular selection of that musical universe is driven primarily by a kind of random or so-called pseudo-random choice that's being made by the computer. And Nikita knows well and better than I the longer history of these kinds of processes. So maybe you could talk briefly about how something like IMG sits into a bigger picture, maybe, of music generation that uses, in some ways, very similar techniques, but instantiated in pre-digital or pre-computational technologies.
Yeah, right. So this program IMG1 was, of course, not the first one in the world to do anything like that. And even long before the computer age, there were experiments and ideas about how to use some sort of simple mathematical procedure or some sort of simple mechanical sorting mechanism to help generate, if you will, or create or craft melodies, sequences of chords, things like that. So this actually goes back centuries. What I think is very interesting that you have mentioned is this idea of randomness, which stands at the root of what we have in front of us with this IMG one program. And then in the beginning, you have like chaos, and in the end, you have a cosmic order. And there are steps in between which filter um, the chaos and the randomness by making it more predictable and more redundant. The presence of redundancy in our signal is a sign for us that there was some sort of will or procedure or order that acted upon the randomness to turn it into something recognizable against a random background.
Yeah, that, and this is a really important part of it's interesting. I appreciate the way that you put it there, is to say that it's a sign of that process rather than saying that it's a sign, for example, of intentionality rather than being the definition of intentionality, right? It's important to keep those things clear in our heads. But yeah, this idea sort of, when we've thought through it before, reminded me of the work of Abraham Moll, a French polymath who made contributions to aesthetics and things like random art generation and random music generation, using a kind of broadly information theoretic or cybernetic vocabulary, such as that of randomness versus redundancy, information as a quantity that could be measured with reference to definitions of mathematical definitions of information and so on. And one of Moll's goals is to put one's finger on what is a sort of tolerable level of redundancy between these two poles of like entire disorder, like total disorder, which is indistinguishable from noise, and total order or banality, which is, you know, so information poor as to be itself meaningless. And of course, there's lots of different nuances to different cybernetic theories of meaning or whatever. But for Moll, anyway, you know, we can think about certain kinds of art music as being kind of quite information dense, and other kinds of art music as being slightly less information dense, but still pleasing in a way. And this idea of filtering comes up in his writing. The idea that, and specifically for Moll, it's interesting that technical apparatus can be used as information filters. So again, this is like an application of a metaphor from signal processing to talk about the construction of signs that signify creativity, in short. And so from all these technical apparatus are things like studio equipment that would filter out the frequencies in a recording, or running the tape backwards, these kinds of operations. He considered them to perform a kind of filtering effect. Okay, so if, regardless of whether or not you believe that, that's a different story. But it's a useful metaphor for thinking about the lines of code in IMG1, because they perform a kind of similar function, which is to say, as Nikita pointed out, they take this kind of extreme disorder in its kind of raw, unmediated state as a sequence of random numbers. And I mean, it both impresses a musical template onto it, which is defined by Langston's collaborations with bluegrass musicians, or imaginaries of what bluegrass music is. But also, you know, rejects those proposals from the random number generator that don't lead to a sense of structure, including the kind of 4/8 16 measure structures that we talked about in relation to the bluegrass example. In the other styles, there's a classical music setting, there's a musical dice game setting, there's a quote unquote samba setting. All of these have different musical characteristics that we're all aware of as listeners, the software invites us to think about those stylistic characteristics or musical characteristics as the operation of a set of algorithmically applied filters, essentially, which is a novel. I suppose maybe Nikita and I might disagree about exactly when the novelty comes in, like, at what point in musical history do we start thinking in this way? But anyway, it's certainly a way of thinking about what music is and what style is that comes, that is dependent on a particular technical apparatus being in play, whether it's the computer or whether it's the musical dice game or something like that. And for me, that's one of the biggest messages that I took away from this little experiment, was that it was possible to think about music generation code as kind of filter according to this metaphor that we've kind of briefly outlined.
Yes, I completely agree. Just a very brief note before we kind of end this recording is to think about, as a small provocation, to think about pseudo randomness, which is like randomness to us humans, but which is a mathematically constructed and a mathematically structured stream of values. A pseudo-random stream of numbers is a number which is generated by a function in a computer in a mathematically defined way. It is completely predictable from a mathematical point of view, but it's completely unpredictable to us humans.
Yes.
So there's a twist to it, that this is not real messy, chaotic randomness that we start with. We're already starting with a structured information, but which has a structure we cannot perceive. And we need to put more filters on it to make it seem to us as structures, whereas it already was from the beginning.
Yeah,
I think that's a funny twist we can think about.
Right. Yeah, that's a nice
thing. That's all I wanted to say. Okay, so I think with this short video, we took a brief look at this very interesting program and what it can teach us in relation to music generation, computers, and technology and mathematics, and the glitches of video conferencing software. And as I said, everybody interested in trying out this music generator should visit the website langston.com and use the Boogie Woogie generator there to listen to some Boogie Woogie music. Thank you. Thank you for watching this video.
Thank you.